The sun was barely up, yet the land already shimmered with heat. Deep in the heart of Yellowstone National Park, a lone green pickup truck rumbled down a dusty back road, sending flurries of dust into the dry morning air. At the wheel sat an old man with silver hair, sharp eyes, and hands weathered by time. Walter Granger, a man whose name was etched into the very soil of the land he had protected for over half a century. Today, however, something felt different. The air was heavy, not just with the sweltering heat of an approaching 113-degree day, but with a weight Walter couldn't quite explain. Something in his chest ached, deeper than muscle or bone. Still, he drove on as he always did. The animals of the park were retreating, hiding beneath trees or near rivers in search of shade. But Walter wasn't headed toward shelter. He was going to check on a wounded gray wolf, one that had limped its way back into the recovery zone just days earlier. The same place where Walter had witnessed countless recoveries, rescues, and farewells. He hadn't told anyone he was going out this morning. He hadn't taken his heart medicine. And somewhere just beyond the tree line, something was watching. Walter parked near a thicket of pines, where the land dipped into a shallow clearing surrounded by tall grass. It was there, in that pocket of stillness, that he spotted the gray wolf dog, a rare hybrid that had strayed close to human territory in its time of weakness. Its hind leg was still bandaged from the injury it had sustained in a snare trap set by poachers 2 nights ago. The animal lifted its head as Walter approached slowly, the old ranger's boots crunching softly on the earth. The wolf dog didn't growl. It simply stared, eyes calm and ancient, as if it somehow recognized the man walking toward it. Walter knelt down, breathing heavy from the walk and the heat. He reached out, not to touch, but just to observe. The animal's side rose and fell steadily, and for a moment, Walter smiled. A small, hard-won smile of a man who had spent a lifetime tending to the wounded wild. Then came the sharp pain. It struck like lightning across his chest, stealing his breath and blurring his vision. He collapsed sideways into the grass, clutching his ribs. The world spun. The chirping of insects became a dull hum in his ears. He tried to call out, but his voice was barely a whisper, lost in the wind. Far off, 2 young rangers, Ben Carter and Mason Wells, were checking fencing near the west side of the sanctuary when Ben stopped mid-step. "Did you hear that?" he asked, head tilting toward the woods. Mason nodded. Sounded like someone calling. They dropped their tools and ran. When they reached the clearing, they found Walter sprawled on the ground, sweat soaking through his shirt, eyes fluttering. Ben dropped to his knees, checking for a pulse. It was there, but faint and wild. Mason tore through Walter's pack, searching for his medication. Nothing. "Damn it," Mason muttered. He didn't bring it. Ben was already on the radio, voice tight. "Dispatch, this is Carter. We have a medical emergency. It's Walter Granger. We need med-evac at Section 9. Now." The siren of the rescue vehicle broke through the thick silence of the sanctuary like a blade. It tore down the dusty trails, swerving through the redwood shadows and sunlight, racing against time. Inside the clearing, Ben knelt beside Walter, one hand gripping the old ranger's arm, the other gripping hope. "Hang on, Walt," he whispered. "You're tougher than all of us." Walter's eyes fluttered open for a second, just enough to catch Ben's face, and then closed again, his chest rising in shallow spurts. When the medic team arrived, they moved fast, their boots stomping across the dry brush. They loaded Walter onto a stretcher, strapped oxygen to his face, and rolled him into the truck. Mason climbed in with him, never letting go of his mentor's hand. "Don't let go, Walter," he murmured, voice cracking. The truck roared down the gravel path, its red lights bouncing off tree trunks. Back at the station, the medical room buzzed with urgency. Nurses barked orders. A doctor pressed defibrillator pads to Walter's chest, and the machine screamed in reply. The room pulsed with tension, 10 minutes, then 15. And then silence. The lead doctor looked up, eyes solemn. "We lost him." The world didn't end in a roar. It ended in stillness. Mason backed into the corner, hand over his mouth. Ben stood frozen in the hallway, listening to the absence of sound. For a moment, the sanctuary felt completely quiet, like the trees and animals themselves had paused to mourn. News spread like wildfire. Phones buzzed, radios crackled. Rangers stopped their tasks mid-motion. At the main cabin, a group of volunteers cried openly, unable to believe that Walter, the man who was the spirit of the preserve, was gone. The grief was deep and wide, but there was no time to process. There was one thing they all agreed on. Walter Granger wouldn't want a farewell in some hospital room or a polished city cemetery. He belonged to this land, to the forests and rivers and rustling fields. He would be buried right here, under open sky. The next morning, the sanctuary awoke not to birdsong, but to the solemn hush of morning. Fog clung low to the forest floor, as if the earth itself bowed its head. Rangers, volunteers, and locals gathered in quiet reverence at the central field, the heart of Redwood Pines Wildlife Preserve, where Walter had spent half a century protecting life in its purest form. At the center of the clearing stood a simple wooden platform, draped with a faded American flag and native wildflowers. Walter Granger lay atop it, hands folded peacefully across his chest. He looked calm, as if he had simply fallen asleep after a long day of work in the wild. One by one, people approached to pay their respects. Mason placed a weathered ranger hat beside Walter's head, the same one he'd worn nearly every day. Ben laid a carved wooden plaque reading, Protector, Mentor, Legend. Others brought stones, pine cones, and small tokens from the woods, little pieces of the land Walter had loved so dearly. The air was still, the silence sacred. And then it happened. A low, mournful howl echoed from the treeline. Heads turned. From between the shadows of the redwoods, a large, graying German shepherd slowly emerged. It walked with purpose, its coat dusted with forest debris, a slight limp in its hind leg. As the dog crossed the clearing, no one dared move. No one dared breathe. Mason's heart stuttered. Is that? Ben's eyes widened. It's Scout. Scout, the dog Walter and Ben had rescued over a decade ago. He'd been a broken, starving stray back then, found caught in a poacher's snare. Walter had carried him back in his arms, nursed him back to health, and trained him into the sanctuary's most loyal companion. When the dog finally healed, Walter released him back into the wild outskirts, but not before whispering, "You'll always know where home is." And now here he was. Scout approached the wooden platform, tail lowered, ears relaxed. He circled Walter once, then sat down at the foot of the bed. He bowed his head, pressing his nose gently against the ranger's boot. No one spoke. No one dared disturb a moment. The dog stayed there, still as stone, eyes half closed in quiet sorrow. The hush was no longer just sadness, it was reverence. Awe. As if nature itself had chosen to send its ambassador to say goodbye. People began to cry again, not just for the loss, but for the loyalty, for the love that bridged species, time, and silence. Ben stepped forward, voice barely above a whisper. He came to thank him, and somehow, everyone knew that was true. The final farewell didn't end with Scout's silent vigil. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed gently above the redwoods, the gathered mourners began the slow, solemn walk to Walter's final resting place, a quiet meadow near a stream where he'd often sat watching deer graze and birds drift across the water. Mason and Ben led the way, carrying the handmade pine coffin between them. Others followed in respectful silence, while Scout walked just behind, his eyes never leaving Walter. The procession paused beneath a towering sugar pine tree, one Walter had planted decades ago after a lightning strike had burned the grove. It had flourished, just as the sanctuary had under his watchful eye. They began to lower him into the earth. Mason placed a smooth stone at the foot of the grave, etched with Walter's name and the words, "He guarded the wild and gave it life." Ben stepped forward and placed Walter's old leather-bound field journal beside him, filled with sketches, animal observations, and scrawled wisdom like, "Every life has value, and patience is the language of the woods." Then came a prayer, whispered in both silence and song, some in words, some in memories. Scout stood beside the grave, unmoving. When the final shovelful of earth had been placed, he let out a soft, aching howl that echoed across the clearing like a farewell that reached something higher. From that day on, something changed in Redwood Pines. The sanctuary paused all activity for 2 days, not just to mourn but to reflect. Volunteers shared stories over evening fires, how Walter had once rescued a trapped fawn in the middle of a storm, how he taught children to listen to the trees, how he'd stayed up all night watching over a sick wolf cub. Scout never left the grave. Day after day, he returned, curling beside the stone marker. Sometimes Mason would find him lying there with his nose to the ground, other times just sitting in quiet reflection, ears perked at every rustle in the wind, as if listening for Walter's voice. People began to leave offerings: pine cones, feathers, photos, notes. A small wooden bench was built under the sugar pine so visitors could sit and feel what Walter had felt: peace. And the sanctuary changed, too. A new program was launched in his name, the Walter Granger Wildlife Guardian Initiative, teaching young rangers not just how to protect animals, but how to understand them. The sign at the entrance to the sanctuary was updated to read, "Welcome to Redwood Pines, where every life matters." As the seasons passed, Scout grew slower, his muzzle whiter. But every morning, without fail, he returned to that meadow. And when he finally didn't, they found him lying peacefully beneath the sugar pine, his eyes closed, his head resting gently on the grave. They buried him right beside Walter, 2 guardians reunited at last. Mason and Ben still walk the sanctuary trails. Every so often, they swear they hear a distant bark echo through the trees. Maybe it's the wind, maybe it's memory, or maybe, just maybe, it's Scout, reminding them that love like Walter's never truly fades. It just takes root and keeps growing. The story of Walter Granger and Scout serves as a poignant reminder that some bonds transcend the boundaries of species and time. It teaches us that love and loyalty are not confined to our human relationships, but can be found in the wild, where animals and nature communicate in their own silent ways. Walter's devotion to the land and its creatures wasn't driven by fame or reward, but by a deep, unspoken understanding that every life, no matter how small, is valuable. In his footsteps, we learn that true guardianship is rooted in respect, patience, and selflessness. In the end, the legacy of Walter Granger and his faithful dog Scout is not just etched in stone or in the memory of a sanctuary, but in the hearts of all who come to learn from the wild. They remind us that sometimes the greatest gifts we can offer are our time, our love, and our unwavering commitment to protect the fragile beauty of the world around us. And perhaps, most importantly, they show us that even in the most painful farewells, the love we give can echo across time, leaving behind a legacy that endures far beyond our years.